Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Zamir Kraft, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 17 waiver wire targets for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, if you're watching today's episode, congratulations. You are one step closer to Championship Sunday and becoming a 2023 fantasy football champion. Now, over the course of today's video, we're going to try to help you achieve that goal by capturing a victory in Week 17 by mentioning players at all variety of positions: running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, quarterbacks, kickers, and defenses. Players who could potentially start in your lineup this week if you are in need. Again, many of us are dealing with injuries at a variety of different positions. Many of us potentially swap kickers and defenses on a weekly basis based on matchups, weather, all that kind of jazz. So if in fact you need that, this is the entire purpose of today's episode, mentioning players so that you can pick them up, play them, take them away potentially from your league mate that is playing up against you this week, and of course, capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. Now, before I get into today's content, for those of you who are looking for a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description. While you're down there in the description, be sure to subscribe, click the like button. It is greatly appreciated. Also, for those of you who are trying to get my rankings for this upcoming Sunday, while you're down in the description, you can check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, you'll get the benefits that you can see on screen. You'll get my rankings sent to you this upcoming Sunday morning by position, by tier, flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings. So take advantage of the opportunity. Of course, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. And of course, if you go ahead and sign up before Saturday's game between the Detroit Lions and Dallas Cowboys, you can take advantage of the new customer special of Dak Prescott, 0.5 total yards. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about running backs going into Week 17. Our number one in the thumbnail of today's episode is Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He's currently only rostered in 36% of Yahoo leagues. But the primary reason he has so much value going into Week 17 is because of the matchup and the injuries to the backfield of the Kansas City Chiefs. Yesterday in the game against the Las Vegas Raiders, Isaiah Pacheco went down with a concussion. He is currently in the concussion protocol, and the likelihood is he's most likely going to miss this upcoming week. I've only ever seen 3 players this season, and all 3 of them were quarterbacks who have cleared concussion protocol within 1 week. Therefore, my assumption is that Isaiah Pacheco will not play. If you are in need of a running back, Clyde Edwards-Helaire can absolutely provide that to you. Now, on top of that, Jerick McKinnon is also injured, so he will not be in this entire conversation. It'll be CEH having this entire backfield to himself, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals, who are one of the best matchups at the running back position over the course of the last 11 games. They're giving up nearly 14 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. And on top of it, we know that Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a capable receiving back. Just a couple weeks back in Week 15, put up an 18.1 half PPR fantasy point performance. So why not going into this week against the Cincinnati Bengals? On number 2, Khalil Herbert. Every single week, and I think for the last 3 consecutive weeks, I've mentioned a different Bears running back. Once it was Deontay Foreman, last week it was Roschon Johnson, this week it's Khalil Herbert. It's very difficult to predict what they want to do with this backfield, but technically, if in fact Deontay Foreman is going to miss another consecutive game going up against the Atlanta Falcons this week, it's most likely that Khalil Herbert will be the number 1 back of this team. He's coming off a performance of 20 rushing attempts, 112 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown, 18.6 fantasy points against the Arizona Cardinals, where we thought there was a potential in which Roschon Johnson and him would split a little bit more. It was all in the direction of Khalil Herbert. And even though Roschon Johnson had opportunities to score on the goal line and had a pretty fair share of overall touches, it didn't come close to what Khalil Herbert was given throughout that game. So going forward, if in fact Deontay Foreman is going to miss time, Khalil Herbert, not a bad option. Currently rostered on only 45% of Yahoo leagues. Moving on to Zamir White, another running back who stepped up once again in the absence of Josh Jacobs. Yesterday, Josh Jacobs, even though the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders had said over the course of the week that he's pretty confident that Josh Jacobs is going to play, I'm assuming it wasn't a matter of his injury, but rather his illness that held him out in yesterday's game. They didn't even need him. Zamir White, 22 carries, 145, 14.5 fantasy points, and the job was done. If, in fact, Josh Jacobs potentially is to miss again, be sure to have Zamir White potentially rostered so you can toss him in there, taking on the Indianapolis Colts, an advantageous matchup on the ground. The number 4 is Chris Rodriguez Jr. If, in fact, we're going to be in a situation with Brian Robinson Jr., the Washington Commanders starting running back is once again, for the 3rd consecutive week, going to potentially miss due to his hamstring injury. Chris Rodriguez is coming off a performance of 10 carries, 58, 2 rushing touchdowns, 19.0 fantasy points and a half PPR. I understand that his matchup this week against the San Francisco 49ers is not an easy one, but again, he could potentially be another starting running back in your lineup, currently only rostered in 3% of leagues, if in fact Brian Robinson Jr. is going to miss another consecutive game. On number 5 is Tyjae Spears. Again, Tyjae Spears and Kenneth Gainwell, 5 and 6, they're basically contingent on the idea that their backfields need to utilize them. Like Tyjae Spears could be utilized if in fact Derrick Henry finds himself failing once again against the Houston Texans. If that takes place, maybe Spears gets far more utilization. If in fact Kenneth Gainwell is going to be in a contest against the Arizona Cardinals, the best matchup at the running back position in regards to overall rushing statistics, Kenneth Gainwell could be in a position in which he's given 7 to 8 rushing attempts in garbage time, and he could end up even falling into the end zone because we've seen it over the course of the season. One of those names I just wanted to throw out, both these players that are potentially available in your league. Now, as I'm sure you would suspect, I'm not going to mention players that are super like hidden gems going into week 17 because we need to just start studs going into week 17's championship matchup. I wouldn't say that all these guys are studs, but they potentially could be in the right circumstance. Moving on to the wide receiver position, let's begin with Noah Brown. If in fact my assumption is correct, and CJ Stroud is going to return to the lineup this week, obviously he's missed the last 2 games in the concussion protocol. And if he returns against the Tennessee Titans, which is an advantageous matchup, a matchup in which Noah Brown just a couple weeks back with Case Keenum in that game, 11 targets, 8 catches, 82 and a touchdown for 18.2 fantasy points. That could be a fantastic play for the given week. Noah Brown hopefully is potentially available. If he is not, of course, move on to the next prospect. Let's talk about Demarcus Robinson, someone who is currently only rostered in 10% of leagues. He has 4 consecutive games of a receiving touchdown. I understand that they take on the New York Giants, and they have played relatively well in the secondary this season in comparison to their lack of ability in terms of stopping the run. But considering how well Matthew Stafford has played in the last 5 games, 14 passing touchdowns, 1 interception, 4 of those passing touchdowns in the direction of Demarcus Robinson. Demarcus Robinson had 6 catches, 82 and a touchdown. That was his entire scoreline from last week. It was all done in the first half. They didn't have to utilize him. They didn't have to throw the ball in his direction because, quite frankly, he had done his job. He's become the Brandon Cooks of this offense as of late, really has dominated, and he'll only continue to do so in an advantageous matchup. Moving on to our number 3, we have KJ Osborn. In the absence of now, TJ Hawkinson out with an ACL season-ending injury. We'll talk about tight ends in just a moment in regards to potentially replacing TJ Hawkinson. And of course, Jordan Addison going down with an injury yesterday. There is a lot of potential in which KJ Osborn, currently only rostered in 16% of leagues, could be a pick-up and immediately played kind of guy. I mean, they take on Green Bay, which is an advantageous matchup considering how terrible that defense has played as of late. I mean, they just allowed the Carolina Panthers to score 30 points on them. So just putting that into perspective, DJ Chark had a day, 2 touchdowns, like 98 yards. But either way, KJ Osborn as the number 2 receiving option after Justin Jefferson in an offense that's coming off of a week in which they had 411 passing yards. I think this is a pretty good overall option for those of you who are in need of a wide receiver, considering the injuries that have taken place to this offense. My number 4, speaking of DJ Chark, like I mentioned just moments ago, 6 catches, 98, 2 touchdowns, 24.8 fantasy points against the Green Bay Packers secondary. Now has an opportunity of a revenge game against his former team, the Jacksonville Jaguars. If in fact he could put up a good performance here, if in fact potentially Bryce Young continues to look in his direction as the veteran receiving threat within this offense, could be a solid play. Currently only rostered in 7% of leagues. We move on to Rashid Shaheed, who really is a gamble every single week. He can make 1 catch and make his entire day, or he'll have himself 2 or 3 catches for 15 yards and it's over. The matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is an advantageous one. We have seen them give up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers over the course of this entire season. It's just a matter of, can we trust Derek Carr to air it out specifically in the direction of Rashid Shaheed and find success? It is a gamble, but one that you might be willing to take in your circumstance. The final wide receiver I wanted to mention, someone that we've mentioned all season long, Demario Douglas, currently only rostered in 21% of leagues, coming off a performance of 9.9 fantasy points. If he's going to continue to lead this, receiving core in terms of overall targets, of course, he's going to be fantasy relevant, especially in a matchup against Buffalo, in which they'll probably be throwing for majority of the game, I would presume. Okay, so that's going to cover it in regards to wide receivers. Let's move on to some tight ends and quarterbacks. So let's talk about tight ends, specifically those that we are looking for to potentially replace TJ Hawkinson, if in fact you have him going into this week, or for those of you who have gotten this far without a stable tight end, which I think is very unlikely, but if in fact you have, congratulations. Let's find you maybe one that can help in this given week. If Hunter Henry is going to return from his knee injury, he's currently only rostered in 26% of leagues. He scored 3 touchdowns in the last 2 healthy games he's played. If in fact he can return this week against Buffalo, could be a solid play. Last week in his absence, Mike Gesicki even scored a touchdown. Bailey Zappi, this offense, it is built around getting the tight end the ball down in the red zone, and if Hunter Henry is available, could be a solid play. Number 2 at the tight end position this week is Tucker Kraft. There are a lot of contingencies that surround him. If in fact we're going to be in a situation in which Jaden Reed, Luke Musgrave, Christian Watson all return to the lineup, that is going to absolutely impact his overall potential for success, because in the absence of those receivers in the last couple games. I mean, we have seen Tucker Kraft for 3 consecutive games, 4 receptions, and 60-plus receiving yards. One of those games with a receiving touchdown. His last 3 performances, 8.0, 13.7, 8.4. Solid performances in a half PPR scoring format. So if, in fact, we're going to be in a position in which some of those receivers return, or potentially Luke Musgrave, who was previously the starting tight end of this team, it would absolutely lower him on my overall rankings. But the final player I wanted to mention is Gerald Everett, currently only rostered in 42% of leagues. If, in fact, he is available, could be a solid option, especially considering they take on Denver, the best matchup at the tight end position. In the last 3 games with Easton Stick, Gerald Everett has 8 targets in each of those 3 games. Pretty solid overall share of opportunity within this offense, especially considering, of course, Keenan Allen has been out in those last couple games. All right, let's talk about quarterbacks, beginning with our number 1. I mean, the gunslinger himself, Joe Flacco. 4 consecutive games of 2+ touchdowns within this offense. 42+ passing attempts in each of those 4 games. Continues to sling the rock. This upcoming Thursday night against the New York Jets, it is a very difficult matchup, but we have to remember that last year, Joe Flacco was the practice squad quarterback and the 3rd-string quarterback at times for this team and played up against that number 1 defense in training camp and for a lot of that season. So he is very familiar with that Jets defense, and considering how well he has played as of late, currently only rostered in 33% of leagues, leading me to a fantasy football championship on different teams, I'm continuing to ride with Joe Flacco. Now we move on to Derek Carr, who continues to put up solid performances himself, 3 consecutive games of 2+ touchdowns passing. Now, even though last week's overall touchdown passes were in garbage time against the LA Rams, we'll take it any way we can get it. They take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This is for their season. And the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, as of late, have been pouring it on against opposing defenses. So if, in fact, we're going to get a game in which they're in a negative game script, hopefully, Derek Carr could find himself some garbage time fantasy points in those circumstances. The final quarterback I wanted to mention, if you're at a point in which you need Nick Mullens, then maybe it's a super flex format, but I don't know, what situation you'd have to be in. Nonetheless, Nick Mullens, even though he's coming off a game in which he threw 4 interceptions, he still had 411 passing yards. Could be a solid option considering how terribly the Green Bay Packers defense and secondary has played as of late. Let's move on to kickers and defenses. Beginning with our number 1 kicker, we have Chase McLaughlin. Over the course of the last 3 games, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as a team have scored 29, 34, and 30 points. That has led to Chase McLaughlin in fantasy football scoring 11, 11, and 14 fantasy points. Takes on New Orleans this week, currently only rostered in 2% of leagues. Pick him up. Moving on to Lucas Havrisik, who for the Los Angeles Rams has been great. Very similar to Chase McLaughlin. He is benefiting from the fact that his offense scores at such a high rate, even though Lucas misses a lot of field goals, and that is pretty much the primary threat to your overall success. If, in fact, we get into a week in which they opt not to kick a field goal because they don't trust him, don't be surprised. But as of the last 4 games, 11, 13, 8, and 12 fantasy points. Pretty solid overall play taking on the New York Giants this week. Let's hope the weather in New York or New Jersey isn't terrible within that stadium. Now, the last player I wanted to mention, also rostered in only 2% of leagues, is Andres Carlson, the brother of Daniel Carlson of the Las Vegas Raiders. Over the course of the last 4 games, this offense has been playing well, but they've also kicked a lot of field goals. 11, 11, 8, and 11. Those are the fantasy points that he has put up as of the last 4 games. Pretty solid play against the Minnesota Vikings this week as the Green Bay Packers fight for their playoff lives. Let's move on to defenses. Beginning with our number 1, the Las Vegas Raiders. Currently only rostered in 13% of leagues. Let me put this into perspective, so hear me out. Since the coaching change of Josh McDaniels to now Antonio Pierce, these are the fantasy point totals of this defense. 19.0, 8, 8, 0. Then they hit a bye week. 12, 25, 21. They have had 8 or more fantasy points in 6 of the last 7 games. They've had double-digit fantasy points in 4 of the last 7 games. Incredible performances across the board. They take on the Indianapolis Colts. This defense is causing turnovers and scoring touchdowns. The number 2, Houston Texans. They had 13 fantasy points last time out against the Tennessee Titans back in Week 15. So with CJ Stroud potentially back this week and the offense a little bit more efficient, potentially able to not, punt the ball as much, score more often, it may force Ryan Tannehill, Will Levis, whoever's at quarterback on the other side of the field to turn over the ball even more in a negative game script, which could lead to a lot of success for the Houston Texans going into this week. On number 3, we have the Chicago Bears. I want to mention them once again, even though they did have a lackluster performance on Sunday against the Arizona Cardinals. They do take on the Atlanta Falcons, again, an offense that I don't really trust because I don't trust the coaching staff. And we have seen that the Chicago Bears can force a lot of turnovers. I would hope that they can get back to that overall base. If, in fact, there are defenses somehow, some way, like the Cleveland Browns still available, please pick them up. There've got to be better defensive options than the Chicago Bears, but if in fact there aren't, they're an option nonetheless. Okay, guys, that's going to cover it in regards to my Week 17 waiver wire targets. I'll be back tomorrow with my top 36 running back rankings for Week 17. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Much love. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.